Welcome back. This is Chicken Philosophy. The Secret of the Golden Flower, part 32, in which we will pick up right where Gwydion left off, and the one with the vacuum cleaner and all that. I think instead of going on and on, because what it is like, I think that if somebody tunes in and this is the first thing they've seen, and I just read aloud what he's saying, then people might get the idea that I agree with any aspect of what he's saying, and so I feel the urge to compulsively remind myself and the world that hey, this is an outdated way of looking at things. So I'm going to do it a little differently today. Basically, we're gonna use the Napoleon Dynamite Xena Napoleon Dynamite spectrum. And we're just gonna throw it up there whenever we're talking about men and women and masculine and feminine and anima and animus, and just so I can you know that I know that you know that I know this is whatever, okay, we're listening to somebody's great-grandfather break down the universe in terms of gender, alright, yeah, that's very 2025, guys, but when we read something on Chicken Philosophy, we read it all the way through, whether we like it or not, and share our feelings about it quite often. So that's going to be my hopefully that'll anyway, but we got some stuff to do before we get there. I think first we'll do the myrrh by itself, not the frankincense and myrrh from church, but the myrrh by itself from a Japanese Buddhist type, or Shinto, I guess you could probably light this same kind of incense at a Shinto temple. Or anywhere else, I'm, for example, doing it in my office, and then recording. Never mind. We're both aware of what's going on, right? Mostly. So that's the incense, and cheers. Got some good old ginger ale. I remember. Well, never mind. I first got into ginger ale when I went to the Bahamas with my mom and my stepdad in 1991, and that's what this is about, Bahamas song, if you want to check that out later. It's technically not even Gwydion wrote that, Schlenschnunheimer wrote that when he took over Gwydion for a little while, 2017. Anyway, so next we do the I Ching, and by that I mean we pull a card from the I Ching deck. There, alright, that's what we're using. And these are all cards that we haven't, these are all, I Ching hexagrams that we haven't gotten yet. So, I'm going to go with solid, broken, solid, triple broken. Edward, if you wouldn't mind, please turn up the music while I look that one up.
50 million years ago, you walked upon the planet sea. Thought of all that you could see, just a little bit like me, walking in your footsteps.
Fire on the bottom, earth on top. That's Li on the bottom and Kun on top. The two trigrams, and that's figure 36. Ming E, darkening of the light. Darkness reigns in the external world now. Disengage from negative feelings and maintain your inner light. Well, that sounds like good advice for us here today. And it seems also in many other times and places throughout history and probably the future as well. Good job, I Ching, at being universal. Alright, so that's going to be our figure for today. Don't need to save the page. Oh, I found this. This is from March 2007. It's I think it's a month bus pass. And they used to give these out. Easy Pass for LA County. Anyway, it's kind of nice. I thought I'd make it the bookmark of Secret of the Golden Flower rather than the usual mild business card. Anyway. And then also, I'm going to mark, just in case I don't finish a section, if I leave off in the middle of something, we're going to mark that. I think that's all the preamble. Suppose we'll get started. Now, I know we're somewhere in this paragraph, and let's get going. In consideration of these, now we've read this before, but this was the end of what we read, and then Gwydion went off on different ranting and raving, and so we never really got into this paragraph. But I'm going to start with this paragraph. But if it sounds familiar, it does to me too. In consideration of these psychological facts, I have reserved the term animus for women exclusively, because to answer a famous question, quote, "Mulier non habet animam sed animam," end quote. I don't care enough to... Feminine psychology contains an element analogous to the anima of man. All right, Editor Edward, I'm sorry. Could you translate? He forgot to translate this into English. The mulier non habet animam sed animam. Apparently it's Latin for the woman has no soul, but the mind. The interesting thing is Carl Jung seems to be making reference to that as if it were a thing from somewhere, but according to Google, it's a thing from Carl Jung's commentary of The Secret of the Golden Flower, and it's made reference to by various psychological things in various languages. But no earlier source that Google's aware of for that statement. Thank you, Editor Edward. Okay. Primarily, it is not of an affective nature, but is a quasi-intellectual element best described by the word, quote, prejudice, end quote. Prejudice. All right. The conscious side of woman corresponds to the emotional side of man, right? Mm-hmm. Not to his mind. Mind makes up the soul, or better, the animus of woman. And just as the anima of the man consists of interior relatedness, full or effect, so the animus of woman consists of inferior judgments, or better said, opinions. Parentheses. For further details, I must refer the reader to my essay cited above, for here I can only touch upon the general aspects, end quote. Yeah. All right. I mean, we get it. It's... The animus of woman consists in a plurality of preconceived opinions, and therefore is not so susceptible of personification by one figure, but it appears more often as a group or crowd. Parentheses. A good example of this from parapsychology is the so-called, quote, imperator, end quote, group in the case of Mrs. Piper, end quote. All I know about the word imperator is traditionally it's a title that must be bestowed upon you by the garrison that you're in charge of, or whatever. If they can declare that you're the imperator, which means you're my ultimate leader, and the gods are with you, and you're fighting for the gods, and if you tell us that it's time to march on Rome, we're right there with you, buddy. that's Imperator, and then that was 2,000 years ago, and then in Golden Dawn tradition, it's the guy who wears red that sits in the northeast corner, is it? Yeah, northeast corner, and is the head of the temple, and sits in the place of Gibura, the red one. Anyway, all right, but I don't know the reference he's making. On a low level, the animus is an inferior logos, a caricature, a demiurge? No, maybe. A caricature of the differentiated masculine mind, just as the anima, on a low level, is a caricature of the feminine eros. Alright. Isn't that the god that, like, had sex with Psyche and became a word that means, like, lust? Carl, you're using an obscure... That's what cult leaders do, is what you have your own definitions for words that you just sort of use, and only the people that are indoctrinated into your... Never mind. Maybe I'm way off here. Following the parallelism further, we can say that just as Hun corresponds to Xing, I don't know how to pronounce those, Hun and Xing, translated by Wilhelm as logos, so the eros of woman corresponds to Ming. Didn't we, something about Ming? Isn't this Ming something? Ming-yi? Which is translated as fate, fatum, destiny, and is interpreted by Wilhelm as eros. Eros is an interweaving. Logos is differentiated knowing. Well, that's one way to put it. He wants to interweave much as anyone, I suppose. Eros is... No, clarify what? Logos is discrimination and detachment. Thus, the inferior logos in the woman's animus appears as something quite unrelated, and therefore as an inaccessible prejudice, or as an opinion, which, irritatingly enough, has nothing to do with the essential nature of the object. So this is Carl talking about the animus, which is masculine, of women, which are presumably feminine, right? In his two-pole universe, you know. I have often been reproached for personifying the anima and animus as mythology does. But this reproach would be justified only if it were proven that in my psychological use of these terms, I concretize them in the same way that mythology does. I must declare once and for all that the personification is not an invention of mine, but is inherent in the nature of the phenomena. It would be unscientific to overlook the fact that the anima is a psychic, and therefore a personal, autonomous system. He's talking about the Xena of the Napoleon Dynamite. The Xena being the higher self or soul thing that you carry with you, and the Napoleon Dynamite referring to that this is people with the same plumbing that he has. So we know. Well, it's old-fashioned these days. It's old-fashioned. None of the people who make the charge against me would hesitate a second to say, quote, I dreamed of Mr. X, end quote. Whereas, strictly speaking, he only dreamed of the representation of Mr. X. So says you, Mr. Carl. I personally put a question mark by a statement like that. The anima is nothing but a representation of the personal nature of the autonomous system in question. I bet she loved it when you called her that, Carl. What the nature of this autonomous system is in a transcendental sense, that is to say, beyond the boundaries of experience, we cannot know. You mean so all those definitive, like, dogmatic statements that you just made have a question mark after them? I have defined the anima in man as a personification of the unconscious in general, and have therefore taken it to be a bridge to the unconscious. That is, to be the function of relationship to the unconscious. There is an interesting point in our text in this connection. The text says that consciousness, parentheses, that is personal consciousness, end quote, comes from the anima. Since the Western mind, all right, new thing on the thing. Okay, this is Western, this is Eastern. All right, just for fun. The Western mind is based wholly on the standpoint of consciousness. It must define anima in the way I have done. But the East, based as it is on the standpoint of the unconscious, sees consciousness as an effect of the anima. All right, now we're back to genders. Without a doubt, consciousness originally arises out of the unconscious. This is something we forget too often, and therefore we are always attempting to identify the psyche with consciousness, or at least attempting to represent the unconscious as a derivative or an effect of the conscious. Parentheses, as for example in the Freudian repression theory. End quote. The voice was my approximation of how Carl Jung would have said it in his head. Anyway. But for the reasons discussed above, it is essential that nothing be taken away from the reality of the unconscious, and that the figures of the unconscious should be understood as active quantities. The person who has understood what is meant by psychic reality need have no fear that he has fallen back into primitive demonology. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. That was a good, I feel like you sort of like just threw that in there, but that was a very solid statement there, Carl. All right, if indeed the unconscious figures are not taken seriously as spontaneously active factors, we become victims of a one-sided faith in the conscious mind, which finally leads to a state of overtension. Yeah, atheists, put that in your pipe and smoke it. No, keep smoking weed, it's fine. Catastrophes are... I'm just kidding, by the way. Not one of those guys. Never mind. Catastrophes are then bound to occur because despite all our consciousness, the dark psychic powers have been overlooked. It is not we who personify them. They have a personal nature from the very beginning. Only when this is thoroughly recognized can we think of depersonalizing them, that is, of, quote, subjugating the anima, end quote. Oh, I bet she loved it when you tried that, Carl. As our text expresses it, end quote. Carl. If that doesn't make sense, it's from the Black Book series. That's the voice of his anima. Anyway. Here again, we find a great difference between Buddhism and our Western attitude of mind. And again, there is a dangerous semblance of agreement. Wasn't I just talking about that in the Martin Luther episode? Buddha and Martin Luther are kind of on the same page until they're not. Anyway, yoga teaching rejects all fantasy contents, and we do the same. But the East does it on quite different grounds. In the East, conceptions and teachings prevail which express the creative fantasy in richest measure. In fact, protection is required against the excess of fantasy. We, on the other hand, look upon fantasy as valueless, subjective daydreaming. Naturally, the figures of the unconscious do not appear as abstractions, stripped of all imaginative trappings. On the contrary, they are embedded and interwoven in a web of fantasies of extraordinary variety and bewildering abundance. The East can reject these fantasies because long ago it extracted their essence and condensed it in profound teachings. But we have never even experienced these fantasies, much less extracted their quintessence. Here we have a large portion of experience to catch up with. Only when we have found the sense in apparent nonsense can we separate the valuable from the worthless. We may rest assured that what we extract from our experiences will differ from what the East offers us today. The East came to its knowledge of inner things in relative ignorance of the external world. We, on the other hand, will investigate the psyche and its depths, supported by a tremendously extensive historical and scientific knowledge. At this present moment, it is true, knowledge of the external world is the greatest obstacle to introspection, but the psychological distress will overcome all obstructions. We are already building up a psychology. That is, a science which gives us a key to things to which the East has found entrance only through abnormal psychic states. Well, the only thing I would want to point out, let's bring up the East to West spectrum. The past. Is this East? East, West? The past. The East in the past as being processed by the West in the present time of 1930, when Carl Jung was writing it in Switzerland. A lot of places were kind of closed off from an awareness of the world, and the stuff going on was mostly farming. But if you reverse it and you consider, like, for example, we're reading Martin Luther here on Chicken Philosophy. He was around in the 1530s. And there are Protestants in the East that have been converted by mostly the British. I think maybe there was a Dutch person here and there that went and converted people to Protestantism. And they're having to process the past of the West in the form of Martin Luther in the context of their present day, looking from Thailand or northeastern India or wherever else in the East. So, there's a yin-yang there, Carl. And I think it's oversimplified and leaves out important information to say, oh, well, the East came up with this in ignorance of the outside world, but we in the West are processing it with all this new information and global perspective. When the reverse can also be said of the shit from our past that they're having to process over here in the East. Anyway, is there anything else? Yeah, this is too short. I'm going to have to start the next section just on principle, because we can't have an episode that's so puny. And I'm sorry about, this caller never... I try, I do, but then it just becomes chaos when I'm not looking, not paying attention. All right. Ooh, there's a little left. All right, Editor Edward, let's change up the music while we start the new section. This section is called The Detachment of Consciousness from the Object. Okay. Let's see where this goes. By understanding the unconscious, we free ourselves from its domination. This is really also the purpose of the instructions in our text. The pupil is taught to concentrate on the light of the inmost region, and, while doing so, to free himself from all outer and inner entanglements. His life impulse is guided towards a consciousness without content, which nonetheless permits all contents to exist. The Hui Ming Ching says about this detachment, quote, "A halo of light surrounds the world of the law. We forget one another, quiet and pure, altogether powerful and empty. The emptiness is irritated by the light of the heart of heaven. The water of the sea is smooth and mirrors the moon in its surface. The clouds disappear in blue space. The mountains shine clear. Consciousness reverts to contemplation. The moon disk rests alone." End quote. This description of fulfillment pictures a psychic state which perhaps can best be characterized as detachment of consciousness from the world and a withdrawal of it to an extra-mundane point, so to speak. Yeah. Thus, consciousness is at the same time empty and not empty. It is no longer preoccupied with the images of things, but merely contains them. The fullness of the world which heretofore pressed upon consciousness has lost none of its richness and beauty, but it no longer dominates consciousness. The magical claim of things has ceased because the original interweaving of consciousness with the world has come to an end. The unconscious is no longer projected, and so the primal participation mystique with things is abolished. Therefore, consciousness is no longer preoccupied with compulsive intentions, but turns into contemplative vision, as the Chinese text very aptly says. How did this effect come about? Parentheses. We assume, of course, that the Chinese author was, first of all, not a liar. Secondly, that he was of sound mind. And thirdly, that he was an extraordinarily intelligent man. End quote. To understand or explain the detachment described in the text, our mentality requires a somewhat roundabout approach. There is no use in our mimicking Eastern sensibility, for nothing would be more childish than to wish to aestheticize a psychic condition such as this. Herein is actually a good point wrapped in a problematic sandwich, Carl. But I can find a diamond in the rough in that one. I can find a baby in the bathwater of that one, which is to say that, yeah, but also, I mean, there's layers and layers. So it's like the Martin Luther thing. Sorry, too many things all at once. Martin Luther and Dogen, and here Carl Jung, basically, is saying that the important part is the message at the heart of it. And all this ornamentation and incense and accents and flowers and colors and things around it. I mean, that's maybe not exactly what Carl's saying, but it's the metaphor I'm drawing, the mandala that I'm painting right now. Dogen says you don't need to stand up on a mountaintop with a wand in your hand, decorated in all kinds of weird shit, and go, "Ah!" that's not Buddhism. And he may have a point. I mean, obviously, those forms of Buddhism were influenced by other things that weren't Buddhism. I mean, Hinduism and Bonpo, just to name a couple. As well as Tao, really. You find elements of all these things in Vajrayana Buddhism. But a person like me is like, yeah, it's like an external expression of forms of spiritual metaphors sandwich. And, then it's just a matter of, do you like the taste of it? Do you like the smell of it? Do you like the way it looks? And is there enough... Well, anyway, the point is, like looking at Catholicism or the act of, like, I'm sure in his day there were people that were abandoning their, or just leaving whatever, England or Switzerland or France and going to Burma and donning an orange robe and learning to speak Burmese and stuff and chanting in Pali. And I would defend their correctness in doing that. You can be into external forms. I mean, you can even be into external forms and miss the point. And it's still better than half the things you'd be doing if you didn't follow your bliss and into some kind of weird cult or monastery, you know what I mean? And then hopefully out the other side, and maybe you can keep the good stuff and leave the bad stuff behind. The point is, what's the point? As far as getting the point in things that are culturally Eastern as a Westerner, or getting the point of things that are culturally Western as an Easterner, that you can get the point of it without the forms. I would just say, like, yeah, that's true, but also, well, you can do it with the forms, if you want to. Like, I mean, if you want to still hang out at the same tavern and be considered cool by the same, like, suit-wearing Edwardian, era, bespeckled, readers of newspapers with pipes and a bourbon and not be considered like the outcast or the weirdo, then do it the way that Carl Jung says to do it. But if you don't mind, like, being, cast out and considered a weirdo by people like that, then go ahead and don the robe. That's what I'd say. I have different advice than 1930 Carl Jung. And I think that might be a good place to close. I think we're close to hitting the bullseye on the half-hour thing. Hope everybody enjoyed today's reading. No use mimicking, more childish than aesthetic than this. Yeah, so, I mean, the point is, it's true to say that the aesthetic is not the point. The Four Noble Truths are the point of, for example, Buddhism, not the color or style of the robes they wore. But these days, I'm personally into exploring the colors and the styles of the robes they wore, generally and specifically speaking, in the sense of diving into the old scriptures and even reading the really boring parts, like about how to, not to wear your robe. Don't let it hang down too low. Don't stand like this when you're wearing it. Don't do this. Don't treat it like that. Don't leave it this far away from you. Like, there's a lot of really small little nitpicky rules, but they're like 2,000 years, 2,000 and some change years old. And I like when Dogen talks about robes too in Shobogen, so we'll come to that in one of the Zen series. This is the Zen series. That's where I read Dogen Shobogenzo. Check that out. And all right, I guess that's it for today. Now we can stop and ponder that next time it's going to be Gwydion, and it's going to be the Meccan Revelations. That's next time. But I hereby declare that it's been too long since I did an episode of Buddhist Books Podcast. And so that's going to be Tipitaka. That'll be the next Tipitaka. Here's the Tipitaka if you want to get all caught up before the new one comes out tomorrow or the next day. Let's see, now I'm committed. I've said it aloud on camera, so there's no going back now. Sometimes just, I don't know. It's weird, because it's all me. I'm my own boss. So I'm like, I should do a Buddhist Books episode. But I don't feel like doing a Buddhist. I want to do chicken philosophy. Yeah, but we've done 4 chicken philosophies in a row since the last time we did a Buddhist Books podcast. Yeah, but I know, but... all right, fine, do chicken philosophy. Like, I'm a good boss. I'm a nice boss. But if the boss takes over the mouth and I say it on camera, Now the employee has to take it as an order. Anyway, I'm sorry. That was all just pretty absurd. That last part. The rest of it was fine. Anything... See, if I want to look past here, then I have to take them off. Then everything's clear out there. But if I want to look... there you go. There I go. Whatever. Anyway, there was a thing. I don't know if I can point to it, so I'm going to play it after the chicken cluck. If you've already seen it in the form of the short, then you've seen it in the form of the short. It's going to be Pymander. So this is for people who are watching everything, and after it got all the way through the Martin Luther 35, the previous episode before this that came out 2 days ago, I think, and saw the footage at the end. The only location that I mentioned anywhere in the episode was New Delhi, and so I think I might have given the impression that the footage at the end that had anything to do with New Delhi, and there was only like 3 seconds of New Delhi in those 4.5 minutes, and so I did a 3-minute short where Pymander clarifies where everything is in that footage of the little trip that my wife and I went on a couple weeks ago. Okay, now the episode's officially long enough, and I'm officially going to close. Then there'll be TB Talka, then we'll be back with Gwydion and Meccan Revelation, and we'll go forward from there. Until then. Welcome back. This is a chicken philosophy short. More appropriately, we're taking a little break from philosophy and doing some chicken geography. Does that sound exciting or what? Sometimes I say things and don't finish the thought, or sometimes I say things absentmindedly. I don't want to put misinformation out in the world, so I am going to briefly break down the few minutes at the end of the previous episode. That's the one that's linked here, Martin Luther 35, where you join my wife and I and our friends and family on a little trip in which we went from Delhi through Uttar Pradesh to Uttarakhand, and then returned back through Uttar Pradesh and arrived in Delhi. Okay, so we're in the airplane on the way from Goa to Delhi. This flag might already be in Uttar Pradesh. Delhi is very small, as you can see on the map here. Us waving here, we're at the equivalent of a truck stop. In America, they have truck stops. This is like a place to pull over and get food on a long trip. This is in Uttar Pradesh, somewhere along the road. So this is Haridwar. That's in Uttarakhand now. That's the Ganges River. Some nice Tibetan flags there. Now we're in Dehradun. This is the top of Dehradun. So Dehradun is a big city. And this is the northernmost point, kind of where it touches the road up to Mussoorie. So we stayed there for one night before we went up the road actually to Mussoorie. Now we're on the road up from Dehradun to Mussoorie. So there are no mountaintops in Delhi. Once when I was a kid, I wrote... Yeah, okay. Well, we're still on the road. We're not quite in Mussoorie yet. Once when I was a kid, I wrote a story that involved a mountaintop in New Delhi. And, of course, I felt like such a fool when I came to India and realized New Delhi is very small and flat. Now we're in Mussoorie. So this is the place where we stayed up there. This is basically the mountaintop of... It is the Himalayas, but it's not... When you think of the Himalayas, you think of snow-capped mountains, Mount Everest, this kind of thing. Obviously, the Himalayas start somewhere, so this is kind of like one of the first mountains. It does snow in the wintertime, but it's not like covered in snow all year round like Everest. Now we're on our way back. We're back down in Dehradun, transitioning from Uttarakhand back to the road that goes through Uttar Pradesh on the way back to Delhi. So we stopped to get something to eat. This is definitely solidly Uttar Pradesh. And now this is New Delhi. This is Santnagar, east of Kailash, New Delhi. As always, wishing you a sincere and heartfelt